Chapter 32. Sam hadn't felt natural since the death of the young gun in the river. He was a fighting man, and fighting had been his way of life for years, but he felt pretty doggone weary now as he doubled back to the southwest and headed up the beautiful valley of the Gallatin. For the moment, anyway, he had a bellyful of it. He had had his fill, like old Bill. Barely entering his 30s, he wondered if he was getting old. Well, he would stretch out in hot water a few days and sweat the pisons out of him, and play and sing some arias, and the songs he and Lotus had sung, even the songs he and Kate had sung. It would be nice to be alone and safe for a little while. He guessed he ought to go over to his father-in-law and see if he had a marriageable daughter, for in making him for the solitary life, the Creator had left something out. In his mind, he now and then had a picture of red devils swarming out of the northern lands like huge infuriated wasps, their stingers hanging long and sharp. They had made the boast that the crows were too cowardly to take him, but they could take him, and they would now do their infernal best. So for a while he would live with the birds and the beasts, and take stock of his resources, and reduce all of the living to the simplicity of bird song and hawk wing and wolf call. He had 3 months before the next trapping season. Perhaps he should go home to visit his people. He could go by steamboat down the river, but if he returned this year, it would have to be overland. Contemplation of a journey of thousands of miles didn't fill him with joy. He wanted to see his people, but he didn't want to see the kind of life they lived. He would never want to live in what was called the civilized life. Here, where men sit and hear each other groan, where palsy shakes a few last sad grey hairs, and youth grows pale, and spectre thin, and dies. It was something like that the poet had written. Neighbors and their children that were all energy and shrieks, debts and mortgages and policemen and funerals and taxes. Out here, thank God, there were no funerals. A man died, the wolves and buzzards cleaned his bones, and that was the end of him. Bill had brought news from Bridger's Post, and it had depressed all the mountain men. This magnificent untamed country was rapidly filling with people. The immigrant trains came all summer now, headed for Oregon and California. The valleys would be poisoned by smoke-belching cities, and a man wouldn't dare lie on his belly and drink from a stream. East of the Great Salt Lake were thousands of Mormons now. Bill said they professed to want only to get away from their persecutors and take as many wives as a man could use, but the basin would fill with them and overflow, and there would be only Mormon wives, where today there were beaver, wild fruits, and peace. The polygamous dames would tramp down all the berry bushes and hack down all the trees, and at last all the Indians and all the elk and buffalo would be gone. There would be, Bridger said, only what was called civilization, and the thought of it made him sick in his innards. How many wives did Brigham have now? 50 at least, and 500 children, Jim said. The truth was that Sam Minard had been born too late, and had come west too late. He had been here only a few years when Brigham came creaking and crawling across the prairies with his Mormon hordes, and now after him came people by the thousands, itching all over to find gold or tear up the country with plows, and to build jails, impose taxes, vote politicians into office, and play like children at being elegant and civilized. Good God, he guessed he ought to push north. In Coulter's hell, with its clean, sharp odors of sulphur pot and steaming geyser, of vast black forests of spruce and pine and fir. Sam looked round him and wondered what it would be like after men with gold pans, axes, and plows were done with it. He tried to imagine it 50 or 100 years hence. Why was the Creator putting so many people on the earth anyway? Doggone it, there were hundreds of millions now. Sam thought a few 100,000 would be enough. There were too many red people, so many that the sites of their old villages gave off foul odors for years and were stains of death on the earth. Let the red people settle for a year or two in a spot, and everything under them and around them began to die and smell bad, like flowers soaked with wolf urine, until you could say, there on the rosebud, there on the bighorn, there on the bell fouche, the chugwater, the teton, the snake, the Colorado, the green. There and everywhere are the death stains, where people blighted what they touched, and nature no longer could do its housekeeping and replace stink with fragrance. There was something about people, Sam decided, and sniffed his hands. There were millions of buffalo, whole seas and oceans of them, and in 24 hours they dropped millions of their dung piles. But in no time at all the dung became odorless chips that were much like a handful of dried prairie grass, but a site on which people, white or red, camped for a few weeks, stunk a man out of the area and over the tallest peaks. Man was, for a fact, such an ill-smelling critter that every beast and bird on earth was afraid of him because of his stink. This fancy made Sam chuckle. The Creator was slipping somewhere. To Sam it seemed that the time would come when all over the earth there wouldn't be an unpolluted stream or a fragrant dell left, or a scented thicket where a man needn't look round him before he sat, or a valley not littered and stricken with human ugliness. Sam would have been grimly amused if told that in another 100 years there would be agitation for wilderness areas in these very lands around him, where persons from the swarming and overcrowded masses could for an hour or two fill their lungs with clean air, hear a bird sing, sense the meaning of peace. In the primitive Edens and gardens, where deer looked at him with their soft eyes, where birds peered through spruce foliage and talked to him, and the highest peaks wore on their shoulders cloaks of white that the sun never drew away, or where on the south flanks he could lie in berry thickets and spill luscious juices down his throat, where he could gather the orange radiance of thimbleberries by the double handful and feed on them while the exquisite soul scents of mountain fruits filled his nostrils and senses, where he could gather the gold and bronze gum of the big fir trees and chew its wood and peak flavors, while stud-hugging the tree to him, to saturate his leather clothing with its smell of mountains and eternity, drawn up from the deep earth and down from the tall skies, where he could climb with the aid of leather halters 60 feet up the golden wall of a yellow pine, taking only his rifle and harp, and find high up 2 or 3 big branches across which he could lie, and look up through a lacework of loveliness at pools of blue and piles of cotton, and play the waltz of the vineyard to the marvelous handiwork of God, where in a deep forest 100,000 or 1,000,000 years old he could dig round him like a bear or badger in the leaf and cone depths, down through a foot or maybe 2 feet of it, feeling the clean earth wonder of it in his hands and getting it all over him and breathing into his soul the earth smells and infinite time of it, until he was filled with all the good unspoiled ancientness of the earth, forest, sky, mountains, and snows, and where he could stretch out full length in the hole he had made and cover himself over with a centuries-old accumulation of humus mold made of needles and cones and twigs, old bark, bird nests, snows, and rains, with only his face and arms out, his being enfolded by the ancientness and the peace, until at last he dozed and slept, and where with hot biscuits, an elk roast garnished with wild onions, a pot of coffee, a quart of blue-purple huckleberries, he could feast not only on food that was free and divine, but on the image of eternal beauty in everything around him, and then fill his pipe and smoke, and hum a few bars from Handel's Messiah, and strain to hear a few faint notes from the infinite orchestras that he thought must be playing in the infinite blue capsule that enveloped the earth, and where at last, when the day was done, he could lie on the fur soft of a buffalo robe, under the jewels that men called stars, with a cover of tanned elkskin over him, drawn up to his chin, so that its scent would mingle with that of fir, red osier, mountain laurel, wild grape, and juniper smoke, and with the odors wafted in from the hot mineral pots, geyser steam, and the sky and the night. He would have remained in the haven until October if he hadn't seen signs of an abnormally deep winter. After years in the mountains, white men knew almost as well as the red, or the wolf, beaver, and mourning dove, nature's moods and auguries. Snow began to fall in the geyser basin in early September. That, for Sam, was warning enough. When a foot of snow fell in 36 hours, he climbed the nearest peak to have a look around him, examining for omens all the things of the forest on his way up. He couldn't see across to the Bighorns east of him, or the Gallatin Mountains north. Where, he wondered, would he trap this winter? The Uintas were still good, but far away, and Bill Williams had been killed down there. There were spots on Bear River, the Snake, the Teton, but soon there would be ranches everywhere, and men building fences to keep their neighbors out. When there were no more open areas to go to, a man who loved freedom more than life would have to settle down with a neighbor within 20 feet on the left and on the right, and a whole row of them facing him across the street. Yonder, away down there, late immigrant trains were crawling along. The next morning he packed and was off. 10 days later, he again stood on a summit and looked round him. What he saw was not black forests, but the plains of the upper Sweetwater, where it left the mountains. He was looking at the Oregon Trail, about 80 miles west of Independence Rock, and at a wagon train creaking and squealing in 6 inches of snow. Another batch of greenhorns would be caught in the mountains, as the Donner Party and others had been caught, or they would be if the sky suddenly opened and dropped a couple of feet of winter. Was it more Mormons down there? He wondered why any man was fool enough to want more than one wife. These people were still 200 or 300 miles from the polygamous saints, and 1,000 from the Dalles or Sacramento. They might have to eat their leather caps and their harness before they got through. He felt an impulse to ride down and ask these people why they hadn't stayed back east where they belonged. Did they believe, as so many had, that out west there were gold nuggets as big as melons lying up and down the canyons and streams, and soil so rich that cabbages would grow as large as kitchen stoves? What tales the jokers had told who had been out west and gone back east. 2 years ago, Sam had ridden over to a train, and a woman, sitting in a covered wagon, had wiped at her eyes with a wrist grey with alkali dust, peered at him over red eyelids, and asked if all the men out here wore skins and married squaws. None of the immigrants seemed to have the slightest sense of the kind of world this was. What they sought was not the scented valleys, the clean sky, the majesties and grandeurs, but a spot where they could all huddle together as neighbors and poison the earth. They made him think of the marching army ants and the 7-year locusts. There they had been, 300 of them, with their beds and tables and crying children and bawling cattle, and their foolish notion that they would soon be rich and well on their way to heaven. Astride his horse, Sam looked at the long wavering line, like pencil markings against the white. Now and then he would turn his gaze from the half-frozen beasts, the cold wagon tires, the stiff, dust-saturated canvas flapping in the wind, and look north and west at the immense world of valleys, mountains, rivers, and sky. Soon there would be no trails left, no forests with berry gardens in their cool depths, no water ouzels dipping and diving at the feet of cascades, no larks singing their arias, no prairie movements that from a distance looked like dark flowing waters, but were herds of buffalo, no wolf song, no cougar cry, no horn call of the loons. Over on the Big Snake, not many hundreds of years ago, there had been stupendous eruptions of boiling lava that flowed over the plain south and west for more than 100 miles, a red-hot hissing and steaming death flow that had killed everything it touched and made utter desolation, black and grotesque and dead, of hundreds of square miles. For Sam and men like him, the immigrant trains were another kind of death flow. Looking east, he saw in fancy 1,000 miles of them, as broad as a buffalo emigration, dust-gray and plodding and exsanguine and inexorable, coming in from the east to cover the earth. He recalled what old Bill had said. "Sure as shooting, they'll shove us up the peaks, and often the peaks into the ocean, and cover this whole land with their privies." Laramie had become an expanding assemblage of log huts and tents, surrounded by piles of buffalo hides as large as haystacks. By July 5th, in only one season, 37,171 men, 803 women, 1,094 children, 7,474 mules, 30,615 oxen, 22,742 horses, 8,998 wagons, and 5,720 cows had passed this fort on their way west. In the past 2 years, scores or hundreds of people and beasts had drowned while trying to cross the North Platte in their shrunken and rickety wagon beds used as boats. He hoped the Almighty knew what he was doing. It was not for a mere man to say that a thing was good or bad, which lay farther than he could see. But men like Sam would have preferred to join an Indian tribe and move north than live where neighbors made life a hell all around them. Leading 2 pack horses, he crossed the trail and rode south, but turned time and again to stare curiously at the creeping wagons, tongue to tailgate and looking like hideous monster bugs. In fancy, he imagined their sucking mouths like a locust's, their legs like cactus spines for seizing and holding, their round, unblinking, opaque-looking eyes that sought in life only what the mouth could devour, and their long sandpaper feelers that nervously twitched and flicked and shook with eagerness when the creature sensed that it had touched an object that could be eaten. During the past hour he had built such a loathsome image of the immigrants and all that they seemed to hunger for, that he felt a twinge of shame and was glad when the day lowered and opened its belly to spill out the big white flakes. He began to hum a Haydn theme. 130 miles and 3 days later, snow was still falling when Sam sat in its lovely gloom and looked at the cabin. It seemed to him that many years had passed since he had slipped up to it to find what was left of his wife and child. His were not the kind of wounds that time could heal. Dismounting, he went over and stood by the door, and when he looked at the spot where she had been murdered, he felt, with almost no loss of intensity, the deep hurt, the anger, the injustice, the idiocy in the divine arrangement, and the loneliness of bereavement that he had felt when he set her skull on his palm. He had looked at the stark white of the teeth, remembering the soft, ripe lips that had covered them, at the empty caves, thinking of the marvelous eyes that had had their home there. He recalled now all the lights and living things that had been in those eyes, the gorgeous mane of her hair, the whole face, and the whole delightful body, and all the living wonder of her that somehow, by a will stronger than his own, had become no more than a few bones and his memory of her. It was this kind of thing that wrenched a man's heart loose and blotted the soul out of him. If only something could survive that was more than the least of what a thing had been. If of a flower there could be more than the dry dead petals, of man more than bones bleaching after the wolves were done with them, of his child some part somewhere of the brave mountain man that he would have been. Far north, it was 800 miles or more, he had 3 times removed stones so that he could reach in and thrust in an armful of flowers. 3 times his hand had softly moved over the pitiable and absurd remains, and crushed petals, and rubbed their essence over the 2 skulls. How utterly death separated the lover from the things he loved. Here, by the cabin door, he kicked the snow away, and sitting where she had fallen, he played a few of the melodies he had played during those few immortal weeks when they were man and wife. Chapter 33. All the mountain men had known what kind of winter it would be. It was the second most paralyzing in the memory of the oldest Indians of the North Country. It set in early and deepened fast. By mid-December, the Missouri was frozen across at the Big Bend and the Yellowstone at the mouth of the Bighorn. August was feeling the chills of September when Kate saw the first blight on her flowers. She didn't know that it was frost. She thought her plants needed water, and day long for a week she trudged up the hill. By October even the late bloomers were stricken, the primroses, asters, and gold stars. The nights were cold and clear, and when the moon was up, Kate sat with her children until it went down. During her years on the Musselshell, she hadn't been conscious of a lost husband. She no longer saw Sam striding along the spine of high mountains, or heard him filling the heavens with deep organ tones. Her life had steadily drawn into the heart of it, until it encompassed only her children and their flowers. Except in moments of fitful sleep, or when chewing at food that was old and stale and tough, she gave all her time to her children and their garden. watering and weeding all day, even when there were no weeds, and reading noble verses or singing old hymns half the night. She had been 35 when her family was massacred. She wasn't an old woman now, but she looked as old as the hills around her. Bill had come by after the killing of the Indians and had been startled on finding her hair completely white. It was not gray, but white, with a look of cotton. Her face was deeply seamed, and the skin over it looked like leather. Her body had shrunk until she was barely 5 feet tall, and it was bent and misshapen like aspens on northern hillsides after the deep snows of winter. It was not labor that had prematurely aged her, but want of food and sleep. She had been so completely devoted to her children that for days on end she hadn't eaten, and she had slept only when too exhausted to read or sing. During these years she had not once lain down to sleep, but had sat by the door. She had so little grasp of the realities and was so far gone to heaven that she didn't understand that the moon was not capricious in its appearances, but came at certain hours. She got the habit of sitting by the door because she thought the moon might appear at any moment, day or night. One dream she had dreamed so many times that she had only to doze and it came again. She was in heaven with her children, and everything there was inexpressibly tender and beautiful. The river of life lay clean and holy and nourishing, and away from it in all directions were gentle hillsides, abloom with flowers and redolent of orchards, and over all of it was a blue sky, as impeccable as God. All the people around her were mothers with their laughing and loving children, gathering flowers, eating berries, drinking from the river, and singing glad little songs of love and thanksgiving. Kate was so happy that she gave off little laughs and cries in her sleep, and on awakening she was so filled with the glory of it that it seemed to her that all her life she had fed on the light and love of the other world. Her world, the lonely hills around her, empty but for her garden, she was only dimly aware of, if at all, for she had been approaching heaven dream by prayer, and was at last on its threshold, even when awake, and was ready to enter and be with her angels. Because she was so otherworldly in her moods, eating had become wholly perfunctory. She would go to the pile of stuff by the wall, and without looking at it, would feel into it and around her, and if she felt something that she thought she could eat, she would begin to gnaw at it. If it was old meat or hard old biscuit, or she would push it into her mouth. If it was dried fruit, the mice had worked all through her food, and had spilled and eaten most of her sugar and flour. If her searching hand came to spilled sugar, she would eat a little of it, or of the raw flour, or she would chew a coffee bean if she found one. Her hunger for food was on the level of her need to void, and for her had no more significance. In the dead of winter, when the cold was deepest, and all her food was frozen, and she was unable to gnaw at it, because her teeth were bad, she would suck at it. Sitting by the door, with all the bedding around her and over her, she would put to her mouth a piece of old hard deer or elk flesh, and suck at it, and watch for the moon. In this terrible winter, she went in December to the river for a pail of water. The river was frozen over from bank to bank. A week ago she had chopped a hole in the ice, but had forgotten it. She now climbed the hill over her snow path to fetch the axe. She chopped until she was exhausted and found no water. This deeply troubled her, for she felt that her children's plants needed watering. The next morning she went down and chopped again. She had at last a hole 18 inches deep. but peering down, she saw that there was no water in it. Trembling with weakness and anxiety, she enlarged it. Because most of the ice chips fell into it as she chopped, she now and then had to lie on her belly and reach down for them. Then, on her knees, she would chop again, with a kind of dauntless perseverance that had put Sam across the cold, wide prairies. She kept at the task until she could see black water 2 feet down. Her hole across the top was 2.5 feet wide. Around it, all the way down, it was jutting and jagged like a talus slope, and, lying face down, she tried to smooth the wall by chipping at it. Reaching down too far, she slipped and went headfirst into the hole. At the bottom it was too small to allow her to go through, and so she stood, head downward, like a cotton-wrapped stopper in a huge ice jug. But at once she began to struggle, and with almost the last of her strength pushed herself up and out. Her axe was gone. If the mountain men could have watched her now, they would have spun another legend around her name. She got to her feet, almost frozen. She rubbed her hands over each other as her strange eyes peered into the hole. She moved back to see if she had been standing over the axe, and when convinced that it had vanished into the river, she didn't hesitate, but lay by the hole and reached into it with her right arm, and let her head and shoulders slip down little by little until her hand was in the water. She didn't know that she was above the eddy, whose black waters were 6 or 8 feet deep. If she could have gone through the hole, she would have entered the water to search for the axe. After she had struggled back from the hole, she was almost rigid, and hand and arm were numbed and senseless. They never recovered from the exposure. The loss of the axe was for her a bitter loss. Day and night she grieved over it, and went again and again to the river to look for it, and in desperation she tried to build a fire to melt snow. Failing in this, and convinced that her plans would die, she sat, trembling and half weeping, bundled against the cold, her attention divided between the sky and the garden. She didn't know, and during these years had not known the month, much less the week or day. Such things as Thanksgiving Day and Christmas she had forgotten. It was 2 days before Christmas, in this bitter year, that the second heaviest snow of the season began to fall. The first 3 days it was a quiet storm of the kind Sam loved, and day and night Kate sat by the door, looking up through a dusk of whirling flakes. Her path to the river was lost, and all trails were lost. An hour or two each day, with bare hands, she pulled the snow back from the doorway and the bedding, and back from the sages where her children knelt. But she was so starved and cold and enfeebled that she had forgotten her flowers. Her consciousness was closing like a shutter, but it would never close on her children before she died, or on the moon in whose light they came. On 3 sides of the cabin, the snow at the end of the 3rd day was over 5 feet deep, and it was that deep on the roof. Time and again she tried to follow her old path to the river, but always turned back, exhausted and weeping. Time and again she searched through the cabin for the axe. Then memory of it was gone too, and of the water pail, and the path, the river. But for hunger pangs she would have lost all memory of food. After 3 days of heavy snowfall, the weather turned colder, and for a week the cold steadily deepened. The northern winds came down. Sam would have said that first they came in the opening phrases of an overture, or in a prodigal pouring of a dozen overtures out of the great northern ice caverns. They would take their time about it, these winds, for they had Beethoven's patience and his skill in devising variations on main themes and in building crescendo on crescendo. If Sam had been in the Wind River country, or here with Kate, where the winds were flinging their wild music headlong, he would have thought that the creator was about to use all his instruments in a major symphony. Kate was barely aware of it. After the snow was up to her roof, and her path was lost, and the world all around her was winter white, she was hardly conscious of the winds sculpturing magnificent snow dunes. At first they gave her only a little trouble. She daily pawed snow back from the sages, so that her children could kneel there if the moon came, and the first gentle winds played around the clearing she had made, and sprayed it with snow gems, but didn't fill it. After the opening chords of the first movement, there were cold, clear announcements from the horns, far in the north, and by morning of the third day of winds, the first movement was in full flow. By noon, the clearing round the plants had been blown level full, but neither in volume nor intensity was the wind more than a token of what it would be. It was a kind of molto adagio. The second movement would be of such percussive violence, with crescendo piled on crescendo, that her cabin would tremble and hum in the furious winter music, and her efforts to clear the snow away from the plants would be only pathetic flurries in the cyclones of white that enveloped her. But she persevered and waited for the moon. It rose, round and frozen and wintry wan, and appeared and disappeared as the winds hurled curtains of snow across its face. The next morning the temperature had fallen to 10 below zero, and in the next few days it fell fast as the second movement came in. The first had been a vast playful statement of themes, as the winds rearranged the snow face of the earth, and if Kate had had any interest in the marvels of a northern winter, she could have looked in any direction and seen the buxom contoured sculpturing of the drifts, the great massifs and mesas of winter white, as Canada hurled its insane genius over the scene. It was a world of superlative purity and loveliness, but Kate could only sit, mute, shivering, half dead, or struggle desperately with the immense drifts that had been flung against the north wall and around the corners, or kneel and dig down to try to find her old snow path. After the cold became more intense, the snow surface was frozen in jewels, and diamond eyes hurled against her face stung like flame. The winds, now denied the joy of sculpturing, seemed to put aside the softer instruments, such as cello, viola, and flute, and to bring in the horns and trumpets and kettle drums. The second movement was allegro mounting swiftly to presto, though for Kate it was only wild winter shrieking. A sharp ear could have heard delightful variations on several themes, as the winter's instruments poured their marvelous harmonies down the valleys and across the prairies and over the high white mountains. Everything in their path the winds played upon, and when they found an object such as Kate's hut, or a naked stone ledge, or a flock of tall shuddering cottonwood trees, the voices would change in both intensity and pitch, and sometimes leap up and down an octave or two, as they modeled the themes to fit the curves and contours of the world, or when wild and high, and climbing with shrill, nerve-shattering energy to the highest notes, they struck the dimples of dells and ravines. The cellos and violas would take over, the harps and flutes, and small soft melodies were played in wind eddies, under overhanging snow-laden plants, and in the blind stone-walled canyons. Sam would have loved it, shouting with all his being to make himself heard. He would have played one of the themes over and over in different keys, as in the third overture to Leonore, and imagined that his melodies were small vocal pockets riding in the winds. He would have gone singing and dancing over the earth, and returned when weary to eat 4 elk steaks and sit by the fire with his pipe and praise the Lord. The fiercer harmonies and wilder movements, even the major themes, were not for the female, whose nest-budded instincts compelled her to seek the tranquil. By the end of the second movement, when the temperature had sunk to more than 30 below, Kate was so numbed and lifeless that she could barely move. Hunger pains would force her, perhaps once, but never twice in 24 hours, to crawl out of the pile of bedding and over to the north wall, where in the gloom her cold hands would feel around and over and through the things there. There was nothing she could chew except sugar or flour, and the mice and insects had destroyed most of those. There was dried elk and deer flesh. There were raisins in the skin bags, frozen as hard as stones. She would take back to the bed a little fruit and a chunk of meat. She would lay them on the hard frozen earth, and after crawling into the pile of bedding, try to warp it evenly all around her, and she would then feel over the ground until her hand came to the food. She would put 3 or 4 raisins into her mouth, and for 10 or 15 minutes suck at them. The meat she could neither bite nor break, and so had to put her teeth and lips over an edge of it, and try to warm and soften it, and suck nourishment out of it. There was no hurry. She had all day and night for this one simple task. When dark came and the moon was there, a wan candlelight in the winds, she would again crawl out of her bedding and feel around in the pile for the Bible. She couldn't walk out, over, or through the snow, for the wind with one thrust would have put her down, and so on hands and knees she crawled until she was about where she used to sit, and there she sat, almost blown away, and stared hopefully for sight of her children. But they never came any more. The snow was deeper than the sages, and there was no place for them. When her frozen body and numbed mind understood that they were not there, she would turn over to hands and knees and crawl back to the bedding. And there she would sit, her ears and nose frozen, her eyes looking at the moon or down at the garden spot, back and forth through the long night, or as long as the moon was up. Before the divine orchestra brought in its third movement, Kate's right hand and both feet were so frozen that blood no longer flowed through them. And before that movement gave way to the fourth, her legs were frozen to the knees. She seemed not to know it. It was the 7th day of the winds, and she no longer crawled over to the north wall. The temperature had fallen to more than 40 below, and the instruments were now all percussive and in high keys. There was nothing the winds could do with the earth. The streams were frozen almost to their bottoms, the trees to their hearts, and in the white sculptured landscapes there was no change, no matter with what force the wind struck them. The winds were now in high piercing tones, thin and wild, and seemed to be preparing for the cold. And then, in a black evening, all the instruments built steadily to the first fortissimo, and in deafening apotheosis came roaring past Kate's door, in such cyclones of sound that the sky literally was filled. And on top of it all, in frenzied explications, came the first crescendo, and on top of it the second, in such thunderous frozen magnificence that Kate was lost within the soul of it. The next morning there was utter silence. Kate Bowden was dead. She sat there in her wraps by the door, frozen almost solid, her face toward the garden, her frozen left hand on the Bible, her frozen eyes looking up for the moon, in a temperature of 52 below. 2 weeks later, snow fell again, and for the next 2 months she was gently and softly buried. Snow drifted in over her and half filled the shack, until there was no sign of her, and no sign of garden or graves. Over the whole scene was spread the purest winter white. Chapter 34. Almost 1,000 miles south, where Sam had a tiny cabin back under a stone ledge, the temperature never fell to more than 20 below, but he knew that it was much colder up north. He worried about Kate, but told himself that she had been inured to the cold of northern winters and would be all right. He didn't suspect that on the Musselshell it was so arctic that trees split open half their length. All deer, elk, and antelope, frozen as hard as stone, dotted the white foothills. Old buffalo bulls had been blown down and covered over, and the feeblest of the coyotes and wolves had succumbed to the northern winds. It had been a good winter for Sam. The extreme cold had produced thicker fur, and when spring came, he had 3 packs of beaver, otter, fox, and mink. On arriving at his chosen spot, he had moved fast to lay in a pile of wood by a ledge, and several 100 pounds of elk flesh, and each evening after supper he had honed his skinning knives, filled his pipe, warmed a spot for his bed, and slept as cozily as the grizzly in its depth of fat and fur. It was May before he could beat a path out of the mountains. It was the 20th of May before he reached the Laramie post. Charlie was in from the Powder, Cy from Lightning Creek, Bill from the Tetons, George from the Hoback, Hank from the Bighorns, and McNeese from the Upper Sweetwater. They had no news except a rumor that Abby Jackson had died of his wounds, and that the nation seemed to be moving toward a war over slavery. As for the past winter, it was the worst, Bill said, since Adam was kicked naked out of Eden and went off alone in the cold. He had wished he had a squaw, for he still loved the women's. He surely did. He guessed he was getting old, for he sometimes felt queersome and had more pains than a politician had tricks. Looking in the mirror of a pool, he had seen gray in his hair and beard, and one day he had fired at an elk standing broadside at 200 yards, and hadn't even scared the beast. "I didn't even raise a hair, I surely didn't." George said he expected they should all be getting a family and settling down. Nice California weather and kids in the dooryard. "George couldn't have a child without help," Bill said. "He must be as old as I am." Bill was 37 and George was 42. "Just the same," George said. "A winter like the last one put cricks in a man's jints. Why, up in them mountains, the wind like to blow theirselves off'n the earth." "Reckon the woman on the muscle is all right?" Bill asked. "Hope so," Sam said. He aimed to get up there soon. Sam bought generously for Kate. There was a lot more to buy than there had been when he came west. Besides raisins, there were now dried apples and peaches, as well as peanuts and hard candy, plenty of salt bacon, dried fish, rice, navy beans, prunes, honey. He bought a few pounds of each, and thread and needles and cloth, moccasins, blankets, flower seeds, a short shovel, and then looked round him to see what else he could take to her. On leaving the post, he didn't for the first time in his years out west head north through Crow country. He was not running from trouble, but he was not looking for it. He didn't want to kill any more young damn fools bent on taking his scalp. After 150 miles, he had no doubt that he had been seen by crows, but none had taken his trail. Had they been cowed by the destruction of Elkhorns and his band, or had the dreadful winter subdued them? Whatever the reason, not a single warrior tried to ambush him or creep up on him during the long ride through the western part of their lands. Near the junction of the Big Horn with the Little Big Horn, not far from the spot where a general named Custer would make his last stand, he saw the fires of a war party that had passed. But when he stood on the bank of the Yellowstone, only 50 miles from the Musselshell, he could say that he hadn't seen a red man in 500 miles. He knew that there was a meaning in this, and he felt that it boded no good. Had the crows made a pact with the Blackfeet that would allow them to capture him again? This thought so enraged him that sitting on a hilltop he filled his pipe and looked south and east at Crowland, and north and northwest to the Blackfeet. He guessed that Elkhorns, his skull heeled over and as bald and white as Dan's, would be looking for him. As a gesture of contempt, both for himself and for the chief, Sam decided to headlong north across the Musselshell and right into Blackfeet land. He would then approach Kate from the west, over the death trail, where, nearly dead and deaf and blind, he had staggered on and on. It was in the foothills that he saw something that stopped him, a skin teepee in an aspen grove. Retreating, he hit his horses and then warily approached, rifle cocked. On reaching the tent he saw that its door flap had been sewed together with buckskin thread, and that the hems of the skin had been staked to the earth all the way around. After a few moments of trying to look inside, he came to himself with a violent start, and quickly looking round him, said aloud, "Sam Minard, this is just the way you were when Elkhorns took you." Leaving the grove, he scouted the area in all directions, but found no human prints, new or old. Though he felt that he was desecrating a holiness, he pulled 3 stakes and on his belly crawled under the loosened skin, rifle in hand. Unable to see anything inside, he propped the edge of the tent up to let daylight in, and then stood and stared for a full minute. On a bed of lodgepoles 2 feet above the earth lay a dead warrior in full regalia, his shield of buffalo hide across his loins, his tobacco pipe adorned with eagle feathers across his right arm, and his medicine bag on his chest over his heart. At the head of the bed, kneeling, was a woman in what looked like an attitude of prayer. Sam knew that she was the man's wife. After carefully studying her position, he guessed that she had knelt there and frozen to death. He sensed that the man was Elkhorns, and he guessed that he had killed himself because his people had cast him out. Sam was deeply moved by the scene. He didn't want to touch anything here, but because he had to know whether this man was the chief, he gently moved her heavy hair back until he could see a part of the skull. What beautiful devotion in a wife! What a poem! What a symphony this picture before him was! The chief had been his deadly enemy, but he must have had remarkable virtues to have won from a woman such love as this. Softly he put the hair back over the skull and the face. The odor of human decay had turned him sick. Dropping to hands and knees and grasping his rifle, he crawled under the tent and looked around him before rising to his feet. He guessed he had better be going. As he rode east, it occurred to him that he and the mountain men had avenged not only his own humiliation, but also the massacre of Kate's family. If it could be said, in earth or heaven, that a wrong so monstrous could be avenged. If Lotus had lived, would she have loved him with such holiness that she would have covered his shame with her hair and have knelt by him and died in the bitter cold? All the mountain men had been impressed by the loyalty of red women to their husbands. They were wildcats in their jealous furies, and they often killed, when they could, the adulterous husband. But they would accept floggings and brutalities that would drive white wives from the door, covering the unspeakable shame of a scalped head with their own hair. They would freeze to death by the man they loved. After crossing the Musselshell, Sam observed that winter had been in no hurry to depart. It was June, but on the north flank of every hill was a snowbank, molded to the hill's contours and dappled with wind dust. No river flowers were yet in bloom. He wondered if Kate's would be. He had with him 20 different kinds of wild flower seed, enough, he expected, to sow an acre of prairie. Kate might not use them, but she would be happy to have them. When building a nest, a woman, like a bird, was happiest when she had more materials than she could use. Except for the willows and shrubs, the plant life hadn't put on its spring dress yet, and the river grasses were barely looking out of the earth. Everywhere were signs that the Canadian winds had been here. Cottonwood trees riven by frost now stood with their bellies open, and aspens had been snapped off by the winds or torn from the earth. When he came to the hill where he had always paused to look at the shack and the garden, he cried aloud, "My God!" and some part of him died. He saw it instantly and knew it all. He saw the second cairn of stones standing close by the one he had built, and he knew that Kate was dead. The grief that choked and blinded him would have been no more intense if he had looked at the grave of his mother. The sky had darkened. The earth had taken on a deeper quiet. It was all desolation now. There were no flowers. There was only an old shack with a part of its roof fallen in and 2 mounds of stones. Dismounting, he dropped the reins and, rifle in hand, approached on foot. The sage plants still lived, and for a few moments he looked at them. Then he looked at the second cairn, observing how the stones had been laid, for his first thought was that a mountain man had passed this way. He had found Kate frozen to death, but he knew it was not that. Something had caught his gaze, and he now circled the 2 cairns and looked down at the sage, most of which had been trampled and broken, and went to the shack to peer in. The pile of filthy bedding was still by the door. By the north wall, with earth from the roof spilled on it, was the heap of utensils and food. Stepping across the bedding, he went over and knelt to examine it. He found an old knife, but no axe. Under the bedding was the rifle. Sam went out and looked south. Something had happened here that he didn't understand. After walking twice around the cabin, he knelt to examine footprints of man and horse. He went east from the cabin 50 yards. He swung north and doubled back to the south, and at the top of a hill found the incredible evidence that he had thought he might find. He knew now that a party of Indians had been here and that they were Crows. This seemed to him so utterly outside the plausible and the possible that he examined all the signs over and over, stared again at the cairn, half expecting that it wouldn't be there, and looked up and down the river and all around him. He knew it was true, but he couldn't believe it. Not all at once. A party of Crows had come here and found Kate in her bedding, dead, with a part of the roof fallen on her, and they had gathered stones and built a house to protect her. and they had taken none of her tools, bedding, food, not even her rifle. How could a man believe that? To be completely sure, he searched over the area where they had hitched their horses, examined footprints of man and beast, studied from top to bottom of the cairn the way the stones were laid, found their campsite, and inspected the ashes of their fire, and then for 2 miles followed the path they had taken eastward over the hills. The implications so overwhelmed him that after 2 hours of searching and study he could only sit and look and wonder. It was this way. They had come in from the southeast, perhaps looking for Blackfeet, and on the first hill from which they had a view of the shack, they had sat on their horses, looking and listening. They had tied 3 of either 7 or 8 horses to a cedar, and in single file had approached the cabin. When 100 yards from it, they had been able to see that most of the roof had fallen in, and that there were no flowers, no woman, no life. They had then moved nearer, and 2 of them had approached the door by going around the north wall. They had found her in the bed. Old woman's men, her children, their ghosts, there, in the blackest nights they are, in the sagebrush, they are crying. Sitting by the bedding, his left palm resting on it, Sam smoked 3 pipes. He was trying to believe that far yonder, in the pale haze, in a small tent filled with death smell, a wife was bowed before her man, her hair hiding his shame, and that here another wife had lived for years, alone, by the graves of her children. Greater love hath no man, but greater love hath the mother. Where was her Bible? He would know some day that they had put it in the cairn with her. Where was her axe? He would never know. Why had the crows done this thing? It was an act of such gracious mercy and pity, or, if not that, of atonement, that he sat humbled before it. So this was why all the way up from the post he had seen no crows. After the 3rd pipe, Sam patted the bedding as though it were Kate, and closed his eyes on loneliness and grief. Then he went to the cairns. On a ledge of stones, shoulder high, he rested his face in his arms and tried to say a prayer for Kate, or a farewell, or something. Prayers had never been a part of him, and he didn't know how to say farewell. The opening of light in the last movement of the 5th, that was prayer maybe, his kind. No matter, the crows long ago had said the only prayer for her that need ever be said. Old woman's men, her children, their ghosts, there, in the blackest nights they are, in the sagebrush they are crying. But not crying now, not any more. From time to time he told himself, head bowed and tears falling, he would pass this way to bring flowers and touch a stone. His wife and child would be here, and Kate and her children. There would be no olive-green sage plants any more, no marigolds and bluebells and gilias, no little grey woman in rags carrying pails of water up a hill all day long. There would now be only memory of her and the story of her, and after a generation or 2 there would not even be that. But as long as any of the mountain men lived, there would be the footfalls of friends passing this way, and eyes looking over to the spot where the crazy woman lived. Meanwhile he had a job to do, leaving everything here as he had found it for time and God to do with. In their infinite patience he mounted his horse, drew tight on the lead rein, and set his course into the southeast, straight for the Belle Fourche and the old chief of the crows. Chapter 35. After he had crossed the Yellowstone, he proceeded through Crow country without his usual vigilance. He shot game, and at night he made a fire and roasted steaks. He sat outlined by flame and smoked his pipe. Though he crossed fresh trails, he saw no redmen. He decided to take the chief by surprise, and so slipped past the sentinels and sleeping dogs just before daybreak. He knew the chief's tent by the size and position of it. At the entrance he drew the skin flap aside and put an ear to the aperture. He had heard that the old chief snored as loud as a shipload of sailors, and after listening a few moments, he guessed he had the right tent. Glancing round him, he slipped inside and stood in the dark. He then threw the tent flap far back, exposing to early morning a part of the interior. Because the chief was an old man, he made in his sleep the sounds of anxiety and unhappiness that the old sometimes make, and so for a few moments Sam stood above him and looked at the face and listened. Then, filling his lungs, he gave the mountain man battle cry. Instantly the chief came bolt upright, and though drugged by sleep and shattered by alarm, he reached blindly for his weapons. Sam had placed himself so that the old fellow would see his face and recognize him. He stood with a finger inside the trigger guard of his revolver and the other hand on his rifle. The chief's first recognition was that he was covered. His second, that the person before him was the dreadful killer of his people. And his third, that the killer was offering his hand and speaking. "Thought I'd done a call on you," Sam was saying. "It's morning. How about some breakfast?" The old man rose slowly to his feet and stood, facing Sam, his eyes searching his face. He looked down at last to the extended hand. "Time we shook hands," Sam said, and seized the old hand and held it. "I figure maybe there's too much killing in the world." Outside, the village was in uproar, with dogs howling, mothers shrieking at children, and braves racing away to their horses. Sam stood his rifle against his belly, released the hand, and drawing his knife, offered it handle first to the chief. When the old man refused to take it, Sam laid his rifle on the earth, unbuckled his revolver and dropped it, and expertly threw the knife so that half the blade was buried in earth between his feet and the chief's. He offered his hand again, saying, "It's time to be friends." The old warrior, one of the greatest his nation had ever had, stepped forward, and standing above the knife, looked into Sam's eyes. Black eye looked into gray blue into black, for perhaps half a minute. Then the red hand came up to meet the white hand. Going to the tent opening, the chief called, and a woman came running. He sent her for pipe and tobacco. In words and signs he asked Sam where his horses were, and sent a warrior to bring them in. Most of the braves had rushed away into morning dusk to find their horses, and now returned to stand in groups and look at the chief's tent. Word had passed that the terror was here to smoke the pipe of peace. As among all impassioned and impetuous people, there were young hot-bloods who wanted to keep the vendetta alive, and would go on dreaming of hanging a scalp on the medicine pole, high above all other scalps there. When full daylight was on them, Sam and the chief, sitting in the places of honor in the village center, smoked a pipe as Sam looked round him at hostile faces. Never in Crow country would he dare to forget the past, for to the end of his days one of the avengers might trail him. While the two men smoked and breakfast was prepared in the fires, the chief looked at Sam with eyes almost 90 snows old and said, "Do all witchy?" Sam thought of Charlie and Cy, and tried to remember what these words meant. The chief now asked him, in signs, if he had a wife. Sam shook his head no. The chief gave a signal. A little old woman, crippled by arthritis and age, hobbled over to him and bent down to listen with half-dead ears, and then hastened away, to return half dragging by the hands a frightened girl. She looked to Sam like a child, but she was slender and lovely, and reminded him a little of Lotus. This, the chief explained, was his youngest daughter, and she was not for sale. He would give her to Sam as a guarantee of that friendship and peace that must henceforth rest between Long Talons and the Sparrowhawks. Sam was touched by the offer. He knew it was a goodwill offering of extraordinary size to give to the killer of his people the only unmarried daughter of the head chief. It was almost as if George Washington had offered his daughter to Cornwallis at Yorktown. It took Sam a few moments to sense the magnanimity of it. He then got to his feet and beckoned to the girl to come to him. She came slinking, shy and hostile, and stood before him, looking down. Stooping, Sam put his left arm under her rump and straightened, and there she sat in the cradle of his arm, her black eyes staring at him. One who read the human female more unerringly than Sam might have thought her stare a fascinated blend of hate and admiration. Hate because this was the monster, admiration because her father had said that as a fighter Long Talons had no match in all the lands of the earth. "Why for me?" he asked her, but she only stared. She was a little heavier than Lotus, he thought, and a little taller. He liked the womanly female of her on his arm and her pressure against his shoulder. He liked the intelligence in her eyes. He set her down, but didn't release her at once. With his left arm across her back and her black hair coming to the top of his shoulder, he looked round him at the braves, at the women and children in a large group beyond the braves, and at the smoke of breakfast fires. He didn't want the girl, but he didn't want to offend his host. He now had to match the chief's generosity, and this, it seemed to him, he could barely do, unless he gave everything he had and walked away. But then he thought of the panniers bulging with stuff for Kate. That was it. The chief would think he had bought all these things for him and his people. So with words and signs he told him that he had brought gifts to the great chief of the Sparrowhawks, and clasping the girl's hand, Sam walked over to his pack horses. There he released her and began to strip the panniers. A 10-yard bolt of cloth in brilliant colors he gave with a slight bow to the girl. He didn't observe that she was rigid with amazement and joy. All the other things he gave to the chief, who almost melted with happiness, for he felt that at some trading post Long Talons had bought these things for him. During the hours he spent with the chief, not a word was said about Kate Bowden, but the chief knew that Sam knew what had been done, and Sam knew that he knew it. The Indian male was in fact a sentimental soul, but from early childhood there waited for him a pattern of life in which he would be brave, daring, ruthless, and conquering. The chief wanted to know if the pale people from the rising sun were going to keep coming until they overflowed the land and drove the red people out. Sam said he would fight for his red brothers before he would see them robbed of their ancient lands. That pleased the chief, and so they smoked another pipe. Sam had given him 4 pounds of tobacco, and to the young warriors around him he promised tobacco and rum. The chief said they were all friends now. His people had enough trouble fighting the Blackfeet and the Cheyenne. He wanted only peace with the mountain men. While Sam took breakfast with the chief, the daughter stood back, her black eyes studying the white man. Perhaps she was trying to imagine what life would be for her as his wife. The Crow women were menials, but they seemed fairly contented with their lot, and they boasted louder of their lords and masters than any other women Sam had known. This girl, he supposed, was thinking that she would gather the wood, set the fires, cook the food, tan skins, sew and mend garments, find forage for horses, and berries and roots for her man, while in fringed and beaded buckskin he rode arrogantly away to kill an enemy or a bull. So far as Sam knew, no Indian girl had ever preferred a white man to a red. He didn't know whether he would ever come back to claim her or ever want another wife. If he could be at peace with all the tribes around him, he would have the life he wanted, the free, wide world of valleys and rivers and mountains, of natural odors and natural music, where the black currants and red chokecherries and red plums bent their boughs toward him, and his drink was pure water, and his bed was the earth. If he were not slain by man or beast, some day he would be old, and like the old bull, he would go off somewhere and be alone to wait for death. But he had before him, he hoped, 20 or 30 years of full living and millions of square miles to live them in. Hot steaks and bird throats singing to him, and mornings as fresh as the first alpine lily, and evenings as deep with peace as the earth under them. Turning on a hilltop, he looked back at the 1,000 sparrowhawks watching him, and made a sign which said that he would come again some day. And then he galloped off into the southwest and a brilliant Reuben sunset. Maybe he would go down to see Jim Bridger, who was having trouble with Brigham Young and his Mormons. When a few days later he came close to the Oregon Trail, he paused, as in former times, and looked at the scene before him. There they were, hundreds or thousands of them, as far back as he could see in clouds of dust, and as far ahead a long grey line of bawling beasts, and squealing axles, and creaking wagon beds that hadn't a drop of moisture left in them. There they were, pushing on, like the armies of red ants, and behind them were other thousands on their way or getting ready, and in the future their children's children would swarm over this magnificent land, chasing to their death the last elk and deer, shooting the last songbirds, trampling the last berry bush, there and everywhere, with their houses and hotels and saloons and gutters, their towns looking like gigantic magpie and crow nests, there and everywhere, proliferating, crowding, and making untidiness and stench of everything. A people bumping and stumbling to get out of one another's way. Every Indian tribe was becoming more restless as the hordes poured in, and before long there would surely be bloody war between the red and the white. During the hour that he watched the slow, dust-saturated serpentine crawl of a wagon train 4 miles long, there filled him the realization that his way of life would someday be no more. For a little while there would be patches of it left, up in Canada, but here it would all be what Jim Bridger said it would be, swarming human masses with the effluvium of their body smells and city smells and machine smells, rising to fill the heavens and wash away the blue. Sam didn't know if the Creator had planned it this way, or if it was only the blind way of the blind. He remembered what a musician had written after hearing that Don Giovanni overture, that he had been seized by terror as there unrolled the ascending and descending scales, as answerless as fate and as inexorable as death. Sam guessed he wouldn't go on to Jim's post now, but would turn back to the bird wings and giddy road runners and bluebirds, spilling lyrics out of the clean blue loveliness of their souls. He would go back to the Bruegel mornings and Rubens evenings, and see what Bill was doing and what Hank was doing, and he would find the bushel of wild flowers and lay them gently over the bones of 2 mothers and 1 child. And so, after a last long look at the immigrants, he turned and headed straight north, back into the valleys and the mountains.